Okay, welcome everybody, and I'm very happy to have you here for the bilingual reading and talk on Lev Ozerov's book, Portraits Without Frames. And let me introduce our speakers today, Irina Mashinski, Boris Dralyuk, and Maria Bloshteyn. And just to anticipate that at the back of the room, Abigail is selling the books, which we were told not supposed to do. But
all the more reason to do it. Get it when you can.
That's where we're doing.
Shh. Okay, that probably should not have been recorded. Everybody welcome. Boris Dralyuk is a literary translator and the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. His recent translations include Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry and Odessa stories, and Mikhail Zoshchenko's Sentimental Tales, from the last one from Columbia University Press. He is also the editor of 1917 Stories and Poems from the Russian Revolution, and co-editor with Robert Chandler and Irina Mashinski of the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry that came out in Penguin Classics in 2015. Irina Mashinski was born in Moscow, graduated from the Physics Geography Department of Moscow University, where she completed her PhD studies specializing in paleoclimatology, so she's responsible here for climate change. She is the author of 10 books of poetry and translations. Her first English language collection, The Naked World, is forthcoming from the publisher I cannot pronounce.
Spite and
Dival. Okay. She is co-editor with Robert Chandler and Boris Dralyuk of the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, Penguin Classics 2015, and co-founder with the late Oleg Wolf and editor-in-chief of the Stosvet Literary Project, which includes Cardinal Points Journal, co-edited with Boris Dralyuk and Robert Chandler, and currently published under the auspices of Brown University's Slavic Studies Department. Maria Bloshteyn received her PhD from Toronto's York University and was postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University. Her scholarly interests lie in the field of literary and cultural exchange between Russia and the United States. She is author of The Making of a Counterculture Icon, Henry Miller's Dostoevsky, and the translator of Alexander Galach and Anton Chekhov. Her translations have appeared in a number of journals and anthologies, including the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, Penguin Classics, 2015. So, welcome everybody. I am Julia Trubichina, professor here at Hunter.
Well, thank you, Mia, for having us, and thank you to Hunter College and all of you for coming out and finding the basement, and then finding the basement within the basement. Quite a journey. Very Tolkien-like. So we're here to talk about Lev Ozerov's Portraits Without Frames, but hearing those introductions brought to mind another story of connections, which this book is. It's a story of connections. And that's the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. The project was spearheaded by Robert Chandler, who's not here. He's one of the 4 people responsible for this book. Every time we hear this introduction, where in my bio you hear the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry co-edited with Irina Mashinski, and in hers you hear the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry co-edited with Boris Dralyuk and Robert Chandler. I think there's a name missing, and we brought it up on Thursday, and the name is Maria Bloshteyn, whom we discovered through the process of editing the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. And we've been carrying on a correspondence about poetry and poets now with you since 2014, so 5 years. And you and I since 2011, and Robert and I and you since about 2011 to 2010. You've been old, 20. So this is a very long story of poetic exchange. And in the process of researching both the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry And in just talking and exchanging daily emails, thousands and thousands of emails, we've made a lot of interesting discoveries. One of those discoveries is Lev Ozerov, about whom I'll tell you a little bit now. Ozerov was known to me as a writer, as a Soviet-era Russian Jewish poet who wrote decent poems. I can name a lot of people like that. There are a lot of Soviet-era Russian Jewish or Ukrainian Jewish writers who wrote decent poems. I think.
And we're decent people.
And we're decent people.
There were a few of those.
Yeah, some of them. Yeah, there were fewer. Exactly. That's true. You can count on one hand. But he was not known to me as a great poet, and it was only through the process of reading cover to cover works by these poets of the second tier or third tier that we began to find real gems, real treasures. In Ozerov, the treasure that we found was his late work, the work that he wrote as the Soviet Union was collapsing in the late 1980s and into the first years of the 1990s. He was born in 1914, a few years before the Russian Revolution of 1917, and he died in 1996, a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. His life was a kind of bracket around the Soviet experience. The kind of person he was, the kind of career he made, would have been impossible without the Soviet Union. There were poets of Jewish extraction who made careers before the Soviet Union. There were Jewish poets writing in Russian before the Soviet Union came to power. But there was not the kind of efflorescence of Jewish literature that we saw in the 1920s and 1930s. Ozerov was a part of that. He was born in Ukraine, in Kiev, into a middle-class Jewish family. He received a fairly good education, but not the top-flight education. The times were tough when he was growing up, and yet his parents were able to hire a Hebrew and Yiddish tutor. He learned those languages as a child. And he had one foot in Russian culture. His name was a pseudonym, Ozerov. His real name was Goldberg. But also a foot in Jewish culture. He loved Russian poetry, but he also loved the poetry of the Jews resident in the Soviet Union who wrote in Yiddish, and became a kind of bridge between these two worlds. So what I knew about Ozerov was that he wrote decent Russian language poems, and that he worked very hard, although I discovered more of this and Robert and I discovered more of this as we went along. He worked very hard to be a good person, as he even says, to support the poets around him, to build a community in very difficult times for poets who could one day be in the favor of the regime, and the next day be arrested and carted off in the middle of the night. He tried to build continuities between communities of poets. He tried to be friendly to this and that group. And he tried to resuscitate the careers of poets who had fallen on hard times, both those who had perished and those who were living in oblivion, like some of the more famous poets that I think all of us know, regardless of how little we know about Russian poetry. Anna Akhmatova, for instance, for 10 years or longer, her name was not allowed in print, simply not allowed in print. Ozerov's article about Akhmatova was the first article later in her career to mention her in the Soviet press. He broke the blockade around her name, as she herself put it. Boris Pasternak was, toward the end of his life and career, as you know, the subject of severe persecution after he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for Dr. Zhivago, which was published abroad. Ozerov was a close friend of his in that hour of need, and then was the first person to publish an edited collection with an introduction of Pasternak's verse after that fiasco. I can go on telling these stories, and I will go on telling these stories for the next half hour. But what I want to say now is a few words about this book. When we discovered this late efflorescence of Ozerov's, what struck us at first was the form of these poems that we were being sent, Robert and I. The poems were like nothing else visually that we saw in his work. Like most Russian poets, he wrote, of his era, he wrote in quatrains that were metrical, that had rhymes, sometimes envelope, sometimes alternate, regular formal verse. And suddenly, toward the end of his life, he began writing these free verse poems. They're not entirely free verse. They incorporate elements of rhyme and meter, but they flow on in a kind of liberated fashion. And the subjects of these poems are the people he has known. It's not uncommon for people late in life to write about the people they have known. In Ozerov's case, he knew some really remarkable people. He crossed paths with just about anyone who was anyone in Soviet culture from the 1930s into the 1980s. He saw their careers develop. He saw their lives cut short in many cases. He saw them fall out of favor and then back into favor. Not only did he see the good people or the martyrs of Soviet culture, he saw some people who were deeply compromised. People who began as great writers but then sold their talent to the regime and were very, let's say, unethical in their treatment of their fellow writers, who then paid the price for that. People like Fadeev, about whom we'll perhaps say a few words later. And in the 1980s, when the moral line seemed to be clearly drawn, there were good people and bad people, what he tried to do in these poems is paint a more nuanced portrait of the whole of Soviet culture. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Mostly the good, of course, but not to the exclusion of the difficult cases. People who survived, and sometimes survived through unethical means, or people who survived until they didn't. So this is what really struck me about this collection. There are 50 poems in the book. When we began translating them, we thought we'd only translate the ones about the really big names, the really important ones. Anna Akhmatova, Boris Pasternak, a handful of others. And as we went on, now exchanging the poems in 4 directions, or however many directions. I'm not very good with directions. I'm not yet the geographer here. As we kept exchanging these poems, we discovered that sometimes it was the names that were not well known that gave rise to the most philosophically and politically and emotionally rich portraits. One of them I can see here in original Russian. Maria will read for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read an example of a poem about a big name. Then I'll turn it over, and then Irina will read. I'll read it in English. Irina will read a little bit of it in Russian, so you get the sense of what it sounds like in Russian. Then I'll turn it over to Maria to read a complicated one about a name that perhaps is not so well known. Sounds so good. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the individual cases in this book. So the poem I'm going to read now is to Anna Akhmatova. Or about. I'll tell you a few things that you'll need to know. One, it refers to a photograph of Akhmatova, a very beautiful photograph that you can see on my blog. Here's a plug for my blog. It's a great blog. There it is, the original. The photograph depicts Akhmatova as a young woman, already an established poet, a kind of a hit in the literary community. And what she's doing is she's lying on her stomach and with her legs touching the back of her head, because she could do that. And why not, if you can? And later in life, Akhmatova could not do that. After a very difficult life, she was no longer able to do that. And what Ozerov does is he describes a meeting with her at a bad moment in her career, when she was no longer the Akhmatova that people remembered, or perhaps wanted to remember, wanted to meet. And what does a person do when they've outlived that glory? How do they go on? And what's really touching about this poem is that Akhmatova is, she doesn't come across as a saint, which is the tradition in Russian hagiographic writing about these poets. They kind of come across as saints. This is not a saint, but it is a wonderful person who comes to life on the page. So, Anna Andreevna Akhmatova. A loose-fitting robe, or a housecoat, or rather a coverall, disguises her corpulence, a gift of the prison cues. Those used to her slimness cannot believe She has grown stout. It's Akhmatova, they say, but not Akhmatova. Who'd have guessed I might end up waiting day after day in those outside prisons, feet swelling, heart giving up, said Anna Akhmatova, as she passed me a photo of herself, straw thin, lying on her stomach and touching the nape of her neck, the fringe of her little white cap with her toes. Painters never tired of depicting her poise, her proud angularity, the bangs, the hump of her nose, the tall neck, her height, her loftiness. Somewhere behind her, a lane and sad space below. By way of background, a balcony railing. The lilac coverall with its dark violet folds overflows and iridesces. Her face is pale, yet lit from within. I received this letter. Please read it aloud. It begins with praise, a bad sign. Best to skip that. Start farther down. They'd asked me for poems. I'd send some, my new ones, of course. And what does he answer? But can't we republish some of your old ones? A pause. What can I say? See how they treat me? I'm silent. What can I say? Like some servant girl. Don't say that, I protest. Everyone knows you're an empress. Akhmatova grows quiet. She gets ready to listen. So I go on as best I can. Of course, you are an empress. She fixes her shawl, lowers her eyelids, lifts her head, and though she doesn't say go on, I do go on, in the same spirit. Who will remember him, this fool of an editor? But every line of yours, whether early or late, will be worth its weight in gold. No, that's not right. It will be beyond price. Without turning her head, Anna Andreevna looks toward the speaker, who sees on her face a fleeting light of pleasure. Beatitude. Everyone on earth, shepherd or prime minister, stoker or poet, wants to hear the word they have been waiting to hear all their lives. As they grow older, people want to know that their life has not been lived in vain.
A few words about this poem and about this moment. So this is what is the scene that is depicted in this poem is actually June 1959, and this is exactly the time when the article about which Boris said was written. In fact, the meeting is early June, and Akhmatova is about to turn 70 on June 23rd, 1959. So he Ozerov is visiting her, and the article has not yet been published. And he's reading the article, she's reading it.
Yes.
It's so good, I don't think it will be published.
Yeah.
And she's actually very anxious for the article to come out. And then there is another meeting in the end of June, also before it's published, and then it's published and everyone starts calling, and it's a huge event. But it's interesting that Ozerov describes the meeting, both meetings, in his diaries that he actually kept since the 40s. Yeah. And he's very reserved in this article. Although the handwriting is illegible, practically, so he didn't really intend it to be read by anyone else but himself. But at the same time, obviously, he's concerned that if all these little notes may end up in someone else's hands, not very friendly hands. So he's very reserved and sometimes very, very laconic.
Yes.
In this case, he's talking about this at length.
Yes.
He's really
letting every detail.
Yes. And there is a line about the empress there, that she does look like an empress, but by some whim of her destiny, she has to write poems instead of being an empress. But actually, she was born to be an empress.
And in a way, of course, she was, in her small, destitute circle of poets, she was an empress of literature. She held court in a way.
Yeah, but the way he comes across a little bit like a sycophant, like
he
keeps saying, "Oh no, you're an empress."
Exactly. But that's what she wants to hear. She understands.
She does, and she senses it. But another interesting detail there in those diaries is that she actually reads the article, the letter in question. She reads it in Italian, and she translates from Italian as she reads. In the poem, it's him, she asks him to read this, so I'm wondering if it's that, he takes liberty.
Oh, I'm sure he takes liberties.
So it's not, that's interesting because it means that they're not 100% documentaries.
No, of course
all
not.
These poems.
And they're written, sometimes 20, sometimes 30, sometimes 50 years after the fact. And in many instances, well, like any work of memory, he's conflating separate meetings into one meeting and things of this kind. With Zoshchenko, for instance, he blends.
Blends. So I would just read. How many people speak, understand Russian here? Okay, so it's worth half a point, right?
Yes, it's worth half a point.
Akhmatova. Широкий халат или хламида, или всего вернее балахон скрывал ее полноту, дар тюремных очередей. Людям, привыкшим к ее худобе, непонятна ее полнота. Мол, Ахматова, да не та. Вы могли и не знать, что в тюремных очередях простаивала сутками, ноги отекали, сердце сдавало. Так говорила Анна Андреевна, передавая мне снимок, на котором она, соломинка, лежа на животе, прикасается пальцами ног к затылку. В бахроме белого чепца живописцы без конца изображали этот стан, эту стать, эту гордую угловатость. Челка, горбинка, высокая шея, протяженность, продолговатость, высота. В отдалении за нею царская сельская аллея, решетка балкона, в виде фона. Балахон светло-фиолетов, темно-фиолетовые складки этого балахона. И так далее. Just to give,
give you a sense of the rhythm.
What kind of, because as we know, no free verse is actually free.
Absolutely not.
There's no such thing as free verse.
And I think you could hear echoes of rhymes, very close set rhymes in the original. What Irina said at an event a few days ago was actually very, I think, perceptive about the fact that for him free does not mean unconstrained, because as you say, there is no such thing as unconstrained verse. What it means is that he has the freedom to shape the narrative any way he wants. He's taken by the story in various directions. And I was thinking, when we were talking about this, that even the very, very finest poets who can command rhyme and meter as well as anyone are always led astray slightly by rhyme. Some rhyme occurs to you that is so good you can't let go of it, so you change what you're saying in order to fit the rhyme. And that happens, I think, to the very, very best poets, and sometimes to great effect. But in his case, he didn't want that kind of diversion. He wanted to be able to follow the thought naturally rather than to let the form take away from the content.
So that stray meanings don't creep in.
Exactly.
But his understanding of free verse, in my opinion, was a little bit old-fashioned because he has this line: по соседству где-то, как антипод сонета, живет свободный стих. So to him, sonnet was an antipode of free verse and vice versa, which is not. I am certainly not in agreement with this, but maybe.
Well, yes, we're now without rhyme being led astray. But my favorite comment on free verse is Audens, who wrote great free verse, and he said that it's writing free verse is like Robinson Crusoe on an island. Sometimes that kind of manly independence produces beautiful results. Mostly, it's just a lot of litter on the floor.
Pound said it was playing tennis without the net.
Yeah, exactly. Tennis without a net. But sometimes it's a beautiful game. It's just that there's no net. In this case, I think it's a beautiful game and some structures of real beauty. So that was Akhmatova. That was a big name, and you can see already that there are nuances of portraiture that aren't, neither entirely positive, neither entirely negative. He wanted to get an impressionistic grasp of the character behind the person. And here, I'm going to turn it over to Maria, who hasn't spoken yet.
So thank you. I have to apologize. I just drove in from Toronto, and I knew that I would be all over the place when I arrived, and I wrote down what I want to say about Ilyich Khachaturian. So this is going to be very Soviet, So this is what you basically need to know about Aram Ilyich Khachaturian. He was a prodigiously inventive and amazingly productive Armenian composer and conductor. So he wrote a whole bunch of pieces. He wrote operas, he wrote ballets, he wrote concertos, you name it, he wrote it. But even during his lifetime, he became associated with one piece of music, and that is the saber dance, which is actually a part of his ballet, Gahane, which he wrote in 1942. So you know, when you think Van Gogh, you think of Sunflowers or The Missing Ear. With Aram Khachaturian, it's the saber dance. But so another thing that you need to know about him is that he was a very, very successful representative of the Soviet artistic elite. He did have a brief run-in with authorities in 1948, I believe, but he very, very quickly regained their good graces. And when the poem is set, like 1970s, he was, not only was he an A-lister as far as the Soviet artistic elite was concerned, but he was given the highest stamp of approval that the state could give you, which is free travel to the West. So he's interesting because of that, but I think this is not why he's included in the collection. You see, Aram Ilyich was a collector, and he collected photographs. You'd say now it would be selfies with celebrities. But back then it was photographs, portraits of himself with, you know, important people, artists, writers, politicians, celebrities. And what he would do with these portraits is that he'd put them up on the walls. So you have your portraits in frames. And I think that serves as a foil for what Ozerov is doing in the book in general. So Khachaturian, why is he doing this? Why is he collecting them? Well, obviously for reasons of self-promotion, self-aggrandizement. He's not really interested in the people he's being photographed with. It's himself. He's interested in their status and himself, you know, as a part of, now that he has a photograph of himself and the Queen, you know, that shows how important he is. So Ozerov, on the other hand, he's also interested in portraits. These are portraits without frames. And created, Borja, I think, put it so well recently, he put together these poems, at first to create, and then to memorialize a community of artists. His own persona is a part of the picture, but never the reason for it. So in this very, very funny poem, and it is funny, Khachaturian goes on a quest to get a photograph of himself with Salvador Dali, the only great missing from his collection. So as you will see, he misses the opportunity entirely through a bunch of events that don't come together exactly the right way. Ozerov, however, gives us two unforgettable portraits for the price of one. You get Khachaturian and you get Dali, proving that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then certainly some well-chosen words can be worth many pictures, and certainly portraits and frames. So without further ado, here is Aram Ilyich Khachaturian. Free time for whims is what makes age alluring. The aging Khachaturian grew to like touring. Rome, Paris, London, Berlin. He conducted, shook hands, represented the state, gave many an interview, enjoyed his fame through and through. Glory, after all, is glorious. He lapped up bravos. The glitter of concert halls held him enthralled. Glad of a chance to further his own fame, he paid his respects to the Pope and Van Karajan, Stravinsky and Britten, the Dalai Lama, the Queen. He was photographed with them, or rather they with him. Some photos were like ads, other more personal. Best of all were the snapshots of handshakes, hands coupled, heads bent forward. In his Moscow apartment, with its sliding doors, he treated guests to Armenian wine, mutach cheese, a few grapes, and these photos, expecting rapt explanations. His albums, his apartment walls were adorned with every major celebrity. The only one missing was Salvador Dali. He must visit Dali, he must see Dali, must chat with Dali, and must be photographed with Dali. Otherwise, both the collection and his own fame would be incomplete. Dali gave his consent. A date was set for a meeting in a remote castle. At the time agreed, Khachaturian and his assistant's assistant, and his photographer, a friend, and this friend's daughter, a budding artist, approached the castle, a truly ancient castle. But in order to enter it, you had to cross a wide swath of swampland. No other way, no footbridges, no guards to assist them. Mud splattered their dress shoes and best clothing. Dispirited and exhausted, they crossed the swamp. The gates clanked open. They entered the empty vastness of the ancient castle, akin to a planetarium or a crematorium. The silence continued. The guests stood in a stupor. This was insane. Suddenly, in all its wild frenzy, dance was unleashed. It was like bolts of lightning. Crossed sabers rang out, struck each other, recoiled, parted, flashed again, clanged again. It was spectacular. The music's proud composer managed to smile. This was, after all, in his honor. He was distracted, however, by the sight of his Angelo Litrico shoes, gleaming new only the day before, but now encrusted with mud. The saber dance drew to an end. After a meaningful pause, Salvador himself appeared, riding a dark horse, dressed like Don Quixote, carrying a spear, of course, but without Sancho Panza. He rode 3 victory laps, respectfully stopping beside his shivering guests. Through half-closed eyes, he looked down at everyone with benevolent condescension, a look full of meaning. Then, thrice brandishing his spear, he withdrew so abruptly that the photographer was unable to recollect what he was meant to be doing there. A pre-recorded message boomed a polite "Arrivederci." Lights went out. The wayfarers exited. "Ouch," groaned the photographer. "Arr," growled the assistant. Khachaturian stayed silent. Once again, they trudged through the surrounding mud. But I said enough about that as I described their approach to the castle of the ingenious Salvador. It is said that this episode cooled the composer's ardor. He went less often on tour to dodgy venues.
That was one of the last poems I think he wrote. It was written in December 1995, 96, so very close to the end. Could still manage a good smile and a good joke. So that was a very light poem, and it contrasts beautifully with a section of very tragic poems toward the center of this book. As I mentioned earlier, Ozerov was a great friend of many Yiddish poets. A number of those Yiddish poets were murdered on the same night in 1952. He commemorated these poets in a very, I think, touching way with a series of portraits, all of them translated, I think all but one translated by Masha. Yes, I think so. Yeah. My favorite of these is the poem Dmitry, but you like the Borschtyn, yes?
I'm going to read the Borschtyn.
Okay, good.
That's the one I've sort of reread and reread.
So if you could,
myself.
that would be great. If you could read the Borschtyn, maybe say a few more words about the Night of the Murdered Poets.
Yes. So after a very funny poem, quite a sad one. So August 12, 1952 went down in history as the Night of the Murdered Poets, the night when the Yiddish Renaissance was executed. It was known as the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee affair, when 13 Soviet Jews in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow were taken in, and then they're tortured. They're all arrested in 1948, 1949, but then they're kept in prison for 3 years. They were tortured, interrogated, confessions were extracted, and then they're sort of tried and executed in 52. I think what makes this very, very poignant is that, first of all, Ozerov knew them. He knew Borschtyn, he talked to Borschtyn, and he considered Borschtyn, in a way, one of his teachers. And another thing that makes it even more poignant, Ozerov wrote an article about it, an essay, that it's not clear when he wrote it, but he couldn't publish it at the time that he wrote it. And only in 1995, he gave it to an Israeli journal that was published in Jerusalem in Russian. And he said, maybe the time has come now for this to be published. And one of the most poignant passages for me is when he talks about the decline of Yiddish, the death of Yiddish. So he says, my grandparents spoke Yiddish and threw in an occasional Russian word. My parents spoke Russian with an occasional, English bit of conversation. I speak exclusively Russian with maybe 2 or 3 Yiddish words thrown in. Now, what they were doing when they were executing these poets, these scholars, these translators, is they were making sure that this renaissance of Yiddish, the revival of Yiddish in the Soviet Union, would not happen. And certainly, we know that it didn't. So my generation, my parents' generation, which were just maybe 10 years younger than Hofstein, they didn't speak any Yiddish at all. And my generation, you know, I know maybe 1 or 2 words. So they're not only executing people, they're not executing these individuals, these wonderful poets, they're executing the culture, they're executing the language. And I think that's what makes it so poignant. There's some funny bits in here too, but it's mostly depressing. You're being warned.
Different point.
Yes. David Hofstein. In that house, there are so many different cloths. White, blue, yellow, red, all makes and types. That not a single moment passed without the sounds of grasshoppers, crickets, cuckoos, thrushes, buntings, finches, all delighting the ear while reminding us of time's passing. The house was filled with sound. Here, time flowed forth willingly into eternity and unwillingly back from eternity into the land of time. The poet listens to both time and eternity, which keeps him in a state of white heat. Blazov, my friend from the Arsenal factory, introduces me to his townsman, the poet David Hofstein, whose apartment I've just described. Hofstein reads us a new poem, woven from snowflakes, pity for other people, and the cruel insomnia of a century fit for neither ape nor man. Your grandfather and your father will understand me. At the very least, they'll hear me out. But your generation has no use for me and my poems written in Yiddish. Don't ask why, but when I leave town and enter the resinous forest in the half-light, I feel that I'm happy, and I'm a poet, and have been given the means to express the forest's rapture, but only in Yiddish. I know other languages, but I can express my joy and pain only in Yiddish. Oddballs is what we call those who are wisest and most honest. He went to buy a hammer, but bought a hat. He went to buy a hat, but bought pears. Went to buy some pears, but bought a pump organ. It took 3 hefty young men to drag it into his apartment, then stand it against the wall like a pipe organ. He was waiting for a streetcar, and when the streetcar came, he took off his galoshes and climbed inside, leaving the gleaming products of the Red Warrior factory behind him on the pavement. It is madness to be a poet, and still more to be a poet belonging to what is hardly the happiest nation on earth. The manuscript on the table awaits him. But who is he to write for if there are no Yiddish schools? But how can he stop writing? Pain must be expressed, if only in words. Speech and her daughter poetry spring up here, there, and everywhere. So, my young friend, what can I say to you? I'm not certain that you will get so much as a thank you for your poems. Go ahead, claim the inheritance of Pushkin, Tutshev, Baratynsky, Bloch. There is no finer profession, but it might not turn out so very well for you personally. I may well be wrong, but I say not a single good deed goes unpunished. He had a poet's heart, a passionate, sensitive heart. When my daughter Yelena was born, he brought a golden challah to our house, a gift for a young mother who had too little to eat. Oh, if you knew what a challah means in times of hunger. Oh, if you knew what a challah means when it is cold. Challah is much, challah is little. Challah, put in your hands by the hands of a friend, is a splash of rapture, a crust of gold. A decade later, he wrote my wife, Margarita, a tender farewell. Premonitions make him gentle, diffuse like twilight. The mildest man I ever knew, not out of cowardice, but because he did not know fear. He was old when I first met him, not from age, but from weariness. Much later, I wanted to see his beginnings, and so I went to Prestashov, his Prestashov. I sailed on the Teterев River, surrounded by pines, rock, the sky overhead, and the sky reflected in water. He was right when he said, how sweetly sad it is to be a human being. Did not specify the degree of sweetness and the degree of sadness. It is hard to bring joy to your own heart, and still harder to bring joy to the heart of another. But he was a bringer of joy when he called the earth a round house. That house has been destroyed, along with the pump organ and the clocks and the volumes of Goethe and the ancient Pentateuch. Oh time, oh space, oh terrible year, he said, holding a handful of dust on his palm. And then he himself became a handful of dust on our century's palm. His own dust is mixed with the dust of others who perished in August of 1952. The location of his grave is unknown. When they name those who perished, they call out the name of the poet, Dmitry Shostakovich, and readers of Yiddish stand up, heads bowed.
Hard act to follow, so I don't think I can. I don't think we need to read any more poems, to be frank. I think you get a full sense of the kind of range of which he was capable, and the kind of portraits that you'll find in this book. So if you have any questions, please ask. The books are available back there. It's a rapidly depleting stack, so buy as many as you can.
It's standing the
Oh.
camera.
But if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. If you want to hear more poems, I'm also happy to oblige.
I wonder if you could tell us where was Ozerov in 52 and 53, when this was happening, because he was also a Jewish writer.
Yes, that's a very good question. I can say that when he was involved with these Yiddish poets, he was a younger member of their group. He was not a member of the. He was not an active member of the JFC, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, but he was very much close to the group and came to meetings. At one of these meetings, he was told to go home. He was told not to show up again, very close to the time of the arrests. The way I remember it, I think it was Peretz Markish who told him not to show up again. He was saving his life. Ozerov, at that time, just around that time of the arrests, he was persecuted, but very lightly in the sense that he was relieved of his post, because he was a very young man. He was relieved of his post, editorial post in 1948. A few years later, after 5 years later or so, he was able to regain his position. He became an editor again. He regained his teaching post as well. So he dodged a bullet literally and figuratively, and was in many ways saved by the people he commemorates in the session.
If I could just add something to this, there's a story about Alexander Galich, who was, of course, a Russian poet and singer. When everything was happening, right before everyone got arrested on the Jewish Anti-Fascist League committee, he came out to one of the meetings. Now, the interesting thing is he didn't speak Yiddish, but he felt as a Jew he had to come out, he had to give a show of support. And Peretz Markish came up to him publicly and basically said, "You're a stranger, what are you doing here? Get out, you don't belong." And he was a very young man too, and he left crying because he couldn't understand what was happening. Markish was so nice to him, and he kept saying, to himself, Markish was so friendly, he was almost paternal, and all of a sudden he kicked him out in such a public way. So what he realized afterwards, when everyone got arrested, is that Markish was the one saving his life, just saying, "You don't belong, get out, save yourself, go."
So this is So that must have been a common occurrence for younger poets in that circle. The interesting thing about what he was able to do for these poets is to keep their memory basically in a drawer for so long. That article was such a touching article that we only discovered fairly recently. That was published in 1995. My favorite line in that article is when he speaks about this loss of Jewish culture, but also remembers an incident from his childhood when his parents did hire a tutor to teach him Hebrew and Yiddish. The way he puts it is, this man, I remember him like it was yesterday. He taught me everything under the sun, although his job was to teach me Hebrew and Yiddish. But he managed a bit of that. But what he mostly taught him is about the culture that he came to love.
Yes, and in 1996, that was the first time in that particular journal, the first publication of the poems Bloshteyn, I think Vitko. They published about 3. That was the first publication ever in Russian.
He did translate from Yiddish as well, and he translated from other languages. He translated from Latvian, I believe, more than from any other language, and also from Ukrainian. There's a section of Ukrainian portraits here.
You mentioned Alexander Fadeev, the head of the Union of the Soviet Writers. Is this one of the poems?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you say a few words about it?
About the
I'm
poem
just
or about
curious.
his relationship?
Yeah, about the relationship, maybe if
Yeah.
not the whole poem, just a little bit. I would like to hear more.
What's touching about this poem is that he recognizes something I think that was true of Fadeev. He began as a very talented writer, and many members of his generation remembered him as a talented writer from the 1920s, despite all of the things that he did. And he stopped writing. He was promising this novel, he had been promising this novel about metallurgy. For years and years and years, he had been promising to write this novel about metallurgy. And he simply couldn't get it out. There was nothing there for him to write. And what Ozerov does, I think, very well is he focuses on the personal life of this man who had become a monster, as a caricature monster for the writers around him. I can read a little bit of the poem if you'd like to.
Oh, yeah.
Toward the end. Okay, yes, let me find it. And you know what Pasternak said famously about Fadeev, that Fadeev, who took his own life after Stalin's death, knowing that the jig was up, the force of persecution would now turn on him, the way that he had persecuted so many others, he shot himself. And what Pasternak said is that with this bullet, he has rehabilitated himself instead of waiting for somebody else to rehabilitate.
He was also an alcoholic.
He was
for
an
many
alcoholic,
years.
of course. So let me see what part I can. Well, I'll start here. The last time I saw Sasha was in Klyazma, early in the spring of 1956, along with Tvartovsky, Lidin, Grubyan, and Maria Petrovna. Tall, gray-haired, red-faced, Sasha appeared in a black car. He was arranging for the daughter of his Red Guard commander to go to a sanatorium. He was hurrying to do good deeds. But then that shot in Betelgeuse, a shot from a 1919 revolver. I have thought a lot about Fadeev. Suicide is never for a single reason. If someone shoots himself, it is always for at least a dozen reasons. The reasons come together. They join up, interlace, interlock in an iron grip. Klava brought me a great heap of Sasha's letters. They overwhelmed me. True living words, cheap vulgarity, despair, faith, trembling reverence. When I tore myself away from these letters, I looked up at Klava. She was no longer crying. Her whole face streamed with tears. All of her was weeping. All of her was a tear. When Klava left, she was a tear rolling over the face of the earth. Poor Sasha, Elsa Triolet wrote in a French obituary. Poor Sasha, spoken with pity and compassion, pain and respect. This is about the man who was lost long before the shot was fired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, just one word about this. In that diary that I was talking about, there is an entry on that day. So Ozerov has hasn't heard from anyone and hasn't heard the official story. So he's responding naturally to what he just. By the way, Semyon Mashinski is no relation. There was this, as many of you know, Gogol scholar, Semyon Mashinski, a big boss there. And he called him and told him what happened in the morning. And Ozerov writes, they say, because people already start talking, they say it's alcohol. But I don't think so. He already, took issue with this.
Yes.
What would probably become, what was going to become the official reason.
And also, well, everyone who knew something about Fadeev knew that it wasn't just alcohol, because that was immediately said. They found him with the bottle and all of this stuff, and the people were suspicious. Shostakovich also was very suspicious that it was alcohol. Shostakovich knew a thing or two about alcohol, and he didn't shoot himself. So yeah, it was. I think the way Ozerov puts it is very effective. You know, it's always
effective, but it's so hard to feel any sympathy for these people.
Of course. So that's the beauty of this book.
Yes.
That it's obviously easy in a way to write about martyrs, right, and feel good about it.
Yeah.
It's much harder to write about shady figures.
Compromised figures.
Compromised. Yeah, shady is a strong word.
Not shady, but black, something that
Certainly
is
some
gray, many
Something
shades
is gray.
of gray.
Many shades of gray, which is precisely the world in which Ozerov lived.
And Fadeev is one of the best of those who
He was one of the
who was
who was at that level. Fadeev was not the worst person, although, well, you know, and of course, that's not what Ozerov dwells in. He doesn't try to rescue him fully. He knows the person he's writing about, but it's a person who was lost a long time ago.
He's trying to find humanity in every culture.
Absolutely.
Even in that very funny story about the selfie.
You know, I wanted to mention that we all knew the story with a completely different interpretation.
Which one about?
About Khachaturian and Dali. It was a story that was repeated many times, and it was sort of urban legend. But in the urban legend, because again, Khachaturian was known basically for the saber dance, right? That became almost
And the waltz.
Yes, as a caricature. The way the story, not the poem, went was that Khachaturian waited, and finally he was given this audience, and he's coming into the room. The door opens, and Dali, stark naked, with a saber in his mouth, dances music, and then like whoops and leaves.
So the only difference is that he was wearing clothes in the poem.
This is a story that he heard apparently directly from Khachaturian.
Yeah. So Khachaturian was cleaning it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe, because that's not the story that was repeated through the 70s. I heard it as a child.
Yeah.
And I remember it was repeated many times.
What I like is that Khachaturian took enough pride in the story to tell it as well. Yeah.
What was Ozerov's engagement with kind of middle brow culture, or kind of more, you know, liminal figures like Utyosov or Ryazanov? Like, how does he, you know, into the later years, right?
Yeah.
Think about what's going on around him in terms of cultural production.
Well, that's a very good question. It's hard to talk about middle brow culture in the Soviet Union because there really is a kind of monoculture of this sort. There is popular culture, and popular culture includes all of these different strata. It's very hard to say which is high and which is low. Which also, I personally, as an Odessan, would not consider this middle brow culture. For me, this is the very height of culture. But
I can explain what
no,
this
I know exactly what you mean.
The Yiddish recordings versus the, you
oh
know,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
So,
absolutely, yeah.
and he was always very kind of ashamed, and all there's stories with Joseph not liking when, you know, his fellow colleagues would play the Yiddish stuff. So that's
of course, yeah, I completely understand. What's lovely about this book is that the references, the side references, the color around the portraits is so filled with references to popular culture, Soviet popular culture, to little asides that Ozerov casts. The way he fills in the portraits will give you a good answer about how in touch he was. I think he was very well exposed to that culture. One of my favorite portraits to translate, for a reason I'm about to explain, was a portrait of Tatlin, the architect and draftsperson and artist, and expert bandura player. He was also a great player. He was a collector of songs as well. And this portrait does not really dwell on his art, on Tatlin's visionary architecture. It dwells on his passion for street songs, the street songs of the Civil War, children's street songs of the Civil War. And so I had the pleasure not only of translating Ozerov in this poem, but also those snippets that he includes of those, you know, "Oh Pity Me" orphan songs, of the early 1920s. So he was very, very much in touch with the popular culture around him, and had a capacious memory, as these portraits testify. He is drawing in the diary, but it's not just the diary. I mean, a lot of this stuff is in his head. You can forgive him for making a few errors, but he remembers an extraordinary number of songs, for instance, that he quotes in these things, and poems. In many cases, the way he wins the trust of the poets to whom he's speaking is by quoting to them long stretches of their poems. There's no better way to win over a poet than by quoting, her or his own poems to their face.
Yeah, I just remember, it brought me back to the time we were working with him. It was such a delight, to get these emails, and there'd be, or his latest version, and the poems themselves are a delight, but also the songs are just so funny. There's a drugstore in the corner. Love can really kill a man. All the other fellas scold me because I've fallen for a dame. And they beat me black and blue if I gave them half a chance. Too bad the song is not more cheerful.
Yes, sir. Got a mama, got a papa, you're on easy street. Me, I'm only a stepmother and not a thing to eat. If you draw 102, you run free. Go have your fun. But I drew the number 1. Now I'm done for. Done. And this is about being caught on the street with this. I don't know if you all know the Republic of Shkid. It's one of the great Soviet novels. If these kids, they were running wild in the streets of Petersburg, but also in the provinces during the Civil War, orphaned or runaways. If they were caught, they would be placed in some kind of facility. But the facilities were so overcrowded that they were given a number. And those that were closest to 1, let's say the first 50, would go into the facility. The rest would be set free so they can run around for another year until they were caught again and given a number. So these kids, in this song, the folk author of the song says, boy, I'm so unlucky. I get to go to a home, a facility. The facility is worse than the street. He'd rather have 121 as a number rather than 1. Tells you a little bit about those facilities, doesn't it? So that's, I don't know, that was a sideways answer, but he was in touch.
It was actually the best. How many years did it take us? 2 years? Were we translating this? 2 years, right?
Yeah.
But I remember those days when Boris was translating this song.
It was that was in Scotland at the time. I really needed some songs to see me.
That's a wonderful way to preserve also something that is otherwise completely lost, because who will remember this? They're lost even in the regional.
That's right. And there are so many versions of them, and this is a way to embed them in culture. In a way, to answer your question, there is a high culture here. Tatlin, let's say, is high culture, but he uses the portrait of Tatlin to embed the world around him, the popular world around him, into the story.
And the camp culture.
And camp culture.
Culture through, obviously.
That's
a
right.
lot of stories here, like Skolov.
Yes.
He somehow, although he was never a prisoner himself, he intuitively.
He listened very closely.
He was a good listener.
Yeah.
What would be the example of somebody? You said that there, and even our description says that there are some portraits of people who are well known, and there are people who are just common people who nobody would know. What would
his
be
father?
The only person who's common is his father, and
who was not common at all.
No, but I mean like not a known name.
The structure of the book, if you go to this quickly depleting pile,
Yes.
you will see that the structure of this book, unlike the original, where all these names are sort of scattered randomly, and the book was never finished. I don't remember if we.
He never published
finished.
it.
It's an unfinished.
Yeah.
It was a work in progress when he died. But the English, both English editions are because there is one in the UK.
Yes.
And both of them is the same book, obviously, and they're structured this way: the poets as a chapter, the poets and the prose writers and visual art, Yiddish poets, Soviet Ukrainian visual artists in theater and dance. So they're grouped, and at the very last poem, his father just follow
And
in a
that's
section of his own.
Yeah, and it's beautifully translated by Irina. Some of the people who are not well known at all are people who died very young. So not only the Yiddish poets whose memory was erased, but people like Ksenia Nekrasova. I don't know if you know the poet Ksenia Nekrasova, but she was not a very successful, long-lived poet, and yet to him a very dear memory, and a poet whose work he wants to preserve. It's an opportunity to preserve her work by embedding it in one of these portraits. It's a great little portrait of her playing a kind of holy fool at the Soviet Writers' Union and running in and demanding to read her poem. It gives him the occasion to write those poems down.
And surely you've given Oh, sorry.
Where you can buy it, or it's possible to buy in Russian, original?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, the Russian is currently out of print. There were 150 copies published in 1999. And there were, yeah, 150 copies, and so in another small run, I think it was republished in a very small run in the early 2000s, and then
2014.
That's
Probably online, no?
It is online, so you can, if you want the Russian originals, you can go to my website again and download the whole PDF or the text. So you can get the poems online, but you can't, unfortunately, buy a copy yet. His granddaughter is working on publishing another edition in Russian.
She lives here?
No, she lives in Moscow.
And we hope that, as it happened with the other books in the history of Russian literature, the appearance of the English, a book in another language, will trigger somehow
Interest.
the interest.
Propels the interest.
Yeah, and it will be published again in Russian.
Russian-speaking people better to read it in Russian.
And for English-speaking people, better to read it in English. And for bilingual people, better to read it in both languages.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to add, like, who now remembers the name of Evgenia Taratuta? She's not well known at all in the West, or I think even in Russia. Do many people read her poetry? And there's this extraordinary portrait of her showing how she used, Robert translated it, how she used poetry to withstand torture. She was being tortured, and she recited poetry to herself. So very ironically, poetry was what got her into trouble, right? Got her in there. But poetry is also what made her stand strong and come out of it a human being.
And
Quite extraordinary.
It is an extraordinary portrait, and one wonderful connection is that Robert actually had the chance to meet Taratuta in person, because she survived. She survived.
When was she arrested? It's the 30s?
It's pre-war.
No, it's pre-war. It should be then it's Great Terror. Probably.
Yes, I think it was.
So she's quite old when Robert
Unless
met
she-
her.
She was very old, yes. It was in the 2000s, I think, or 1990s or
So
2000s.
she had a very long life. Yeah.
She had a very long life, and what was especially wonderful about meeting one of the subjects of the poems is that Robert could confirm that the personality captured in the poem is very much the personality of the person he met.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And there are other connections, personal connections in this. With,
Not with Taratuta.
no, but with other figures in this book, there are other personal connections that Irina has through family
We
connections.
all somehow suddenly found ourselves in the middle of something so unfamiliar first, and then just our own.
Yeah. For me, it was discovering portraits that gave me insight into the people I was translating at the time. Babel, it's a wonderful portrait of Isaac Babel, Mikhail Zoshchenko, and Tarkin, who knew about this love for children's songs. It made me feel closer to a person that was very far away. Any other?
Could you talk maybe a little bit about the translating?
Sure.
This question from me. So how did you divide it up? And then you obviously sent versions to each other. Was there an attempt to make the voice consistent, or did each of you take as much liberty as you wanted?
That's a great question.
Very good question.
So I did my first translation, and then I sent it off, and then everyone would have suggestions and ideas. And And I'm thinking, oh, what an idiot I was. I missed all of these. So then I'd rewrite it, and then, Robert or Oda or Ira would have some other suggestions. And then eventually it would be, you'd have this document, it'd be notes upon notes to comments and notes. And then some would say, no, we have to clean it up, and half the notes would disappear, and we'd have a version that was more or less the version that we'd go with.
Yeah.
And, and that's how it basically worked. It was a
And
real
years later, it
treat.
reappears from the Dropbox, and the new changes are made.
Yes, and more changes. So, but really, it was a delight. For me, after trying to work, I'm very much a wannabe translator. I still regard myself, when I grow up, I want to be like them. So it was, I started translating on my own, and it's a very lonely business. You sit there, just like writing, you sit there with a manuscript or a book, and you have your computer, and you're coming, all these dictionaries, and you ask your, Russian speaking, like I go to my family, my resources, do you remember in the 1930s, do you remember? So, but it was, translating with Robert and Ira and Boya was, it was a revelation, because I think really group translating is the way to do it. You have all, 4 different sets of eyes, 4 different intellects coming into work on a single text.
And yet the text retained the flavor of that original vision,
Oh,
for
yes.
instance.
But we were striving for that, right?
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
all along, that's what we were striving for, to capture the essence of the original.
No, but I mean the original
The
vision of the
truth triumphs.
translator. So in this case, nobody could translate that poem by Khachaturian like Masha. Her gift for those wonderful rhymes. That's all you. The rhythms, the jolly nature of the hopping rhythm. That's very much what Masha does best. And Irina controls lines like nobody else. She's able to see where the line break is supposed to be. Yeah, of course,
You know that.
of course.
But these people there are 2-eared. I'm 1-eared. So I'm their Russian ear. And so I see my role as somewhat secondary in this book, because I have only 1 ear, the Russian one.
But in the land of the deaf,
my English one is obviously compromised. So yes, and we did divide. We pretty much like who wants what. I can go and grab. But later, these people, they're just amazing. They're so amazingly talented, Robert and Masha, or they're so organized and so effective, efficient, and I just couldn't keep up with them.
No, that's not true.
So gradually my little list was dissolving.
So Robert and Boris.
I was take talking because I can't do it.
Well, I really want to talk him,
So,
as you can see.
I ended up only having a handful, but it was a group project, which is, in my case, it's a very strange thing. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a very bad team player in a way. I like to control what I'm doing myself, and I like to do it without co-authors, but this is the only probably exception in my life.
It's like Nabokov was a single man sport, man, except for in soccer or football,
Yeah,
he played goalie. He played goalie because that's the one person. You are our goalie. You're the loner on the team.
But not with you guys. I just go and blend.
Goalie is all by himself. Yeah.
Especially when the action is over there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was in this case a very seamless blend because so many drafts changed hands. It becomes a perfectly communal activity and something that's very addictive. It's hard to let go of that once you get started. So you're always looking for the next project that can allow that kind of
I felt so
collaboration.
sad, felt so sad.
But it was a natural continuation of our Penguin anthology work,
Yeah.
pretty much without any gap.
Yeah.
I was just a late observer. I came in very late, and I was just looking in amazement at what Robert and Boris and Irina were doing, and just applauding on the sidelines. It was just the greatest. I thought I was learning so much. Right? You learn so much when you work. And you see other people at work who are really, really good at their craft, at their art. So when that was over, I think I wrote to you guys. I felt like I had my little, my little contribution, which I was immensely proud of, my college, that I was working on.
But also
And Akujava.
Yeah, and also Vasilisa.
Черный поet.
Yeah.
Who could think that it was translatable?
But then my part was over, and I wrote to them like, the playground, all the kids are playing, and you have to go home. They're still playing there. So out of pity, they sort of kept me on, and I could, look at what they were doing and just continue to learn and be amazed and inspired.
By far, the hardest part of working with these two people is their humility. Everything else is easy.
So you mentioned that there is a British edition.
Yes.
It's the same book, just published in
Same
another.
place, exactly the same book, except different cover.
Ah,
It's published by a different publisher.
Who is the publisher?
Granta.
Oh,
It's not bad.
yeah, I'm
not
not
complaining.
interested in Russian, not complaining.
Yeah.
They interested in Russian literature?
Not
specific?
It's hard to predict what they're interested in. They haven't published that much Russian literature in translation, but they make exceptions to that rule.
Any more questions?
As very, very subjective note. Rushing to this meeting, and I was late, I was send the book to print, and in the last moment I made a change which was provided by the son of a poet who was mentioned here several times, David Markish.
Oh.
And the book indirectly closes another historical circle, and it's called in Russian, the book is in Russian, Чехов как зеркало российского антисемитизма.
Wow.
And my last moment, which I made once again decision, because it was a foreword, after, by the way, 4 leading Russian professors and non-people leading Russia and here objected, didn't want to touch it. Though it's not radical, it's far from being radical. So in order to have it kind of a more mild, so David wrote introduction, I asked him, but this was kind of still asymmetrical, so we came with the afterword, and the last moment which I did now ago was once again to change forward to afterward and how to balance this book, something good. And it, by the way, it will be published electronically in 5 hours.
Wow.
Yes.
What's the question?
It was not a question,
It was
it was a
a
caveat, that historical caveat that we try to connect non-existing dots.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. It's what that story tells us is that the stories in this book are ongoing. That this is a constellation that spreads ever wider. It's a galaxy of Soviet culture. Well, any other stars in the far-flung sky?
Questions?
If not, the book, the stack is replenished. There are more books for sale. Yes, it's growing. Please buy the book.
And they were only $10, which is
$10 is a great deal.
I think we should thank our speakers, guys. It's a wonderful. Thank you.